Good morning, everybody. This is Truth Seeker here, and beautiful, beautiful Friday morning. I took the day off to make a long weekend, kick off the summer, Memorial Day weekend. I wanted to do this outdoors because it's such a beautiful day, but I hope the lighting is okay. Anyway, I'm not the best thing to look at, so maybe it's not so bad if the image is a little dark. So uh, today I thought I'd do something slightly different. Maybe it isn't really different because any of you who follow me know that I often deviate into Watchtower history, Bible student history, Jehovah's Witnesses, and it's always I think it plays an important part. Understanding the historical aspects of it is very important because to understand what happened is to understand how the organization turned into what it is today, the transformation that the Watchtower underwent through the century plus years that it existed. And there's one person in particular who has been an enigma to me because of just by his birth. In a way, I mean, I can understand to some extent, although not maybe really fully. This individual happens to be Malcolm Rutherford. And Malcolm was the son of Judge Joseph Rutherford and his wife Mary. In fact, he was the judge's only child. And the reason I want to talk about him is because there is very little known about him in Watchtower circles, Jehovah's Witness circles, and Bible student circles. He was never talked about much. He's mentioned. He's understood to have existed. There are rumors. If you go to the internet, you will definitely, when you Google his name, you'll see blogs or forums, discussion forums where people talk about him and they offer up, ideas. The biggest thing is his estrangement from his father, and but there are other aspects that are thrown out there. For example, that there was a reconciliation toward the end of the judge's life between Malcolm and the judge, and other such things. Well, the other night, I have an Ancestry account, and I'm really big on genealogy and family, and I go through spurts. Every so often, I'll spend a day or two on Ancestry and look up family history. And I often find interesting things on Ancestry that I didn't know. Just the other day, I found a whole segment of my family from Scotland, the McCubries, and I learned a little about my great grandmother, who I knew. She passed away when I was 13 years old, and I learned the story was always that they had crossed the Atlantic on the Mauritania, and I found out that wasn't true. I found the ship's registry, and it was the Tuscania was the name of the ship that they were on. So little things like that. They're not major, but it's accurate. And so I began throwing in the Rutherford name into the search engine in Ancestry, and Malcolm in particular, because I wanted to see what information there was about Malcolm. There's not much said. Now, hands down, the judge was the most autocratic leader of the Watchtower, the most autocratic leader the Watchtower ever had. There was nobody like him. He wielded unchecked power. Fortunately, the Watchtower was still, I don't know, I guess it was in its growing stages at the time. I mean, it was beginning to take off as a religion by the end of Russell's life. There were tens of thousands of Bible students in 1916 when Russell passed away. But Russell was a well-known figure. He was known across the globe. He had a syndicated column in all of the newspapers, or most of the newspapers in the United States. 2,000 newspapers. Newspapers were the television of the early 20th century. There was no radio, there was no television, obviously. And so Russell was the most well-known preacher at the time. I guess you could call Russell the first super preacher in a way. You know, like today, there are these televangelists like Joel Osteen and others that Jerry Falwell and a bunch of other mainstream Protestant preachers that have become mega preachers, Ted Haggard, and they're known by millions. Well, Russell was the first preacher that was known literally by millions of people, even though the movement that followed him was relatively small in size. And when Russell's untimely death, I call it untimely, he was only 64. I guess in those days, in 1916, 64 could be considered relatively old. But I'm 63, and I'd hate to think that my time is up. You know, we have expectation to live to 80 now, so. But on top of that, Rutherford also is the only president, the only leader that I know of the Watchtower, who not only wielded unchecked power, autocratic power, but also had a family. Russell was essentially, I mean, he was married to Maria, but after 19 years, that fell apart, and a good deal of his ministry was done without her backing and support, especially the part of the ministry in which most of the growth took place, at least during Russell's time. So Maria was not in the picture. She wasn't talked about. And after the turn of the century and his trial was over, they had come to some kind of agreement legally, and she was supported, at least to her satisfaction. At least she could put a roof over her head and 3 squares. And so she disappeared from the scene. Last time Maria really surfaced was at Russell's funeral. She laid some lilies of the valley on his casket, and but after that, you really don't know much of Maria. Or I heard it was pronounced Mariah, even though it's spelled Maria. I don't know. Bible students had indicated that she liked it to be pronounced Mariah. So I don't know. I don't know if that's true or not. But it's interesting what you can dig up in Ancestry. So I began looking up the Rutherford family and tried to trace them through a number of records that you have access to in Ancestry. Now, I've always loved the mystery. As a kid, the Dark Ages intrigued me. We have an old part of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City is an old monastery that was brought over stone by stone from France. And it's an 11th century monastery, Catholic monastery, that they reassembled in Fort Tryon Park in New York City. And we went there on a class trip when I was, I believe, in the fourth or fifth grade. And I just was fascinated. This was the Dark Ages, and it was mysterious. There wasn't much known. And how did the time of King Arthur and the legends, So I always was intrigued with things that were dark, periods of history that were clouded deliberately or not deliberately, but where there is little information, and tried to find as much information about it as I could. And that's the same as during Rutherford's presidency. Now, Rutherford's presidency is shrouded in a lot of mystery in many respects, because he took the organization into an entirely different direction from the way that Russell intended. Russell, at least I think, intended. I do believe that Russell believed there was more work to be done, but I don't think that he ever thought the Watchtower was meant to go beyond the call of the 144,000. I don't think he ever meant the Watchtower to mean or be the vehicle of salvation for humanity. It was always focused on what he called the church class, the 144,000. I believe that he felt that class, that heavenly class, had not yet been completed, even by 1914. And I think he felt that the Watchtower had another mission that it hadn't quite fulfilled, which was preaching the word of the gospel throughout the world. And that element of prophecy had not yet been fulfilled, according to Russell, and so it needed to fulfill that obligation. But I don't believe that he felt that was it was of his opinion that it was going to be that long. It was, another 100 years for that message to be given. In fact, I think, given the means by which the word was spread in later years as technology developed, the radio and later the television, that Watchtower could have, if they kept with Russell's vision of the Watchtower's mission, could have said that work was complete in the 1950s, maybe the 1960s, but certainly not this late in the game. However, Judge Rutherford changed the mission of the Watchtower, and he made human salvation contingent upon becoming a Jehovah's Witness. And he derived this concept of the Jonadab class, and that it was the mission of the the publishers and the um, what do they call those guys? I can't, sometimes I get these blocks. Full-time ministers and ordained ministers to go out and preach in the world, to get as many into the Jonadab class, which was the earthly class, and save them from Armageddon, because the rest of the world was going to die. That wasn't Russell's message. That was purely constructed by Judge Rutherford. But I was thinking of Malcolm, the judge's son, in terms of a father and son relationship. What do we know of Malcolm? He's a rather obscure individual. He was the son of a king, in a way. I mean, Rutherford was autocratic. His word went. There was no questioning his word. Russell was the same way, but Russell wasn't a tyrant. Rutherford was a tyrant. Rutherford had an ill temper. He was ill-tempered. He was also a heavy drinker, if not an alcoholic. And he was not only brusque, he was very insistent. His word or out. That's it. And that happened to many, many people. In fact, he saw that in transforming the Watchtower, that it was a necessity to eliminate all of those who had any sense of loyalty to Charles Russell. And there were an awful lot in the Bible students movement, in the early movement, who worshipped Russell and found it hard to accept Rutherford and his presidency, although they had little to no say over what was being printed and disseminated by the Watchtower. Many stayed associated with the Watchtower because it was Brother Russell's, and that it was God's channel, that it was God's organization of truth, and that he would straighten things out, that eventually all of the errors that were introduced by Rutherford would be straightened out. So many hung in there. So through the 20s, from the time of Russell's death in 1916, the end of 1916, to the middle to the end of the 1930s, was pretty much the time of the Bible student exodus from being associated. They cut ties with Watchtower and began forming their own systems, their own organizations, ecclesias. They created the Dawns, some created the Layman's Home Missionary, some created the Pastoral Bible Institute, and there were the Standfasters. So during the 30s, there were a number of groups that formed out of Bible students that had exited from the Watchtower. But I wanted to look at Rutherford from a little different aspect, and his relationship to his family. Now, I know that's a very difficult task because there's so little known about his family. There's very little known about Mary, his wife, and there's very little known about Malcolm. I know that, and the rumors of Rutherford and his womanizing are rampant. And there's the interview with Hayden Covington at the time when Covington had been disfellowshipped for his alcoholism. and he essentially worshipped Rutherford. Covington happened to be the lead counsel for Watchtower after Olin Moyle so vociferously left the Watchtower, and so if you have ever seen Olin Moyle's letter, you should read it. It was a scathing critique of Rutherford. Kind of a little, I think it's allergies, so I'm sorry. So, but Rutherford, like Russell, is always looked at alone. What I was saying about Hayden Covington, I'm sorry, was that Mary had certain health problems that from what I understand, it may have been a stroke that caused her physical debility. And Covington, in defense of Rutherford and the mistress aspect, got angry and responded and justified Rutherford's philandering by saying, well, his wife wasn't able to perform her wifely duties, and thus, what would you do? And that's how he answered the question. You can find some of that on the John Cedars channel with Lloyd Evans, where he talked about Rutherford and his womanizing. He made a video about that. But that makes for the question, well, how did that work with his family? Now, I can't say that it's exactly the same, but in a way it is. I was the oldest son of the man who ran the Dawn for a decade. And, I worked there. But I was very deliberately kept in the background. My father did not want me being outspoken. He went out of his way to make sure that I wasn't elected an elder in our ecclesia. For one thing, I think he thought I might be a competition to him. I had been in college, and I had some critical thinking training, mathematics, physics, and such. So I think he felt a little threatened there. But I really was hurt, and it cut me to the core to think that my father would treat me in such a manner. And so I kind of empathize, sympathize, I don't know, with Malcolm for being the son, unfortunate son, of the man who headed up the organization, the Watchtower. And the Watchtower, knowing that the Watchtower was the most important thing in his life, and that he didn't really love me, that he really didn't care about me. And so I wonder about that. And it's interesting too, because Malcolm was able to view, it's such a shame. I wish I knew this. Malcolm's life overlapped mine. He died in 1989 at the age of 96. I don't know how clear of mind he might have been then. I don't know. There's so little information about him, especially after the 1940s. There's practically nothing about Malcolm, except internet rumor that some people tried to talk with him about his father and he refused. Historians, people who wanted to write books and document Watchtower history, both Bible student and Jehovah's Witnesses. I don't know how true that is. Again, that's internet talk, you know, how much truth there is in internet talk. You know, you can take that with a real grain of salt. And in fact, I found something there I will speak about later that I think may be unfounded, i.e., that there was a reconciliation between father and son. But Malcolm was born in 1892. Now, Mary and Joseph Rutherford were married just before Malcolm was born. Not that there was any impropriety, as anyone would think, and he was born in the proper amount of time after they were married, but he was born very shortly after they were married. I mean, within 9 months, within a year. They were married December 31st. Joseph and Mary were married December 31st, 1891, and Malcolm was born November 10th, 1892. And all of this information, I will let you know. I'll do my best to let you know what is fact and what I think is maybe mistakes in the factual information that I found on Ancestry, because census records are not always accurate. And also what is my speculation, and also what is internet talk and speculation. So you can put together in your own mind what is relevant, what is true, what may not be accurate, what is accurate. But certain things like ships manifests, you can find these things online. City directories, ships manifests, birth records, death records, and the census records, among other types of records that you can find on Ancestry. But these records are the ones that are most prevalent and the ones that you find most of the information. Anybody who has Ancestry, they can check me, they can fact check me. I may not get so very specific as to which census I got information from. There were 4 census that I did use: 1900, 1910, 1920, and 1940. Those were the only census records that mention anything about the Rutherford family. And as the census records changed, there was different information on different census records. The focus was slightly different census to census, so it wasn't standardized, and so sometimes the questions asked did differ. So what do we know? Malcolm was born in 1892 to a man whose father, and this is documented history about Rutherford, whose father wanted to better himself. They all grew up, raised in Missouri. Malcolm was born in Missouri. So was Mary. So was Judge, or Joseph. And Joseph was born in 1869, Mary in 1870. And Joseph wanted to go to school at the age of 16. And I don't know if he was actually admitted into college at that time, but he wanted to become a lawyer. His father, being a staunch conservative Baptist, wanted him home to work on the farm, selfish reasons. And so they worked out an agreement. This is the kind of background that gives you some insight into Rutherford's character. because his father was a bastard, if you want to call it that. But his father not only insisted that he pay for his own college, but that he also pay for the salary of the person that he had to hire to replace Joseph in the farm, doing his chores, his duties on the farm. And Joseph agreed to do it. Now, that's a pretty tough thing to do. He had to work like a son of a gun. It does tell you about the judge's determination that if he was out to do something, he was going to do it. And so he managed to accomplish what his goal was, which was to become a lawyer. He was a practicing lawyer by the time, by 1894, because he was working in a practice, according to history. And I believe you can find this in Faith on the March, which is in Macmillan's book. I believe this account is in there. That Cole Porters had come to his law office and approached his partner in 1894, and he remembered selling books, encyclopedias door to door to people, and felt sympathetic to these people and bought some books from them. They happened to be the first 3 volumes, and so of the studies in the scriptures. So I don't know how long it was before he really sat down to read them, but once he read them, he had a cynical view of the world. He had a cynical view of religion in particular, and Russell's view or understanding of religion was similar enough to Rutherford's that his interest was piqued. And so he contacted the Watchtower, and before long he and his wife were holding meetings in their home. And this was in 1894, so Malcolm was 2 years old when his father began his interest in the teachings of Russell, of the Watchtower. So I know what it's like to grow up a child in the Bible students. And back in those days, the idea was children were to be seen and not heard. He had no siblings, nobody to kind of rely on. He was alone. And I think he probably had to sit in the back of the meetings as quietly as could be in his Sunday go-to-meeting clothes. The meetings were held in their home, and so he was held hostage in his home until the Sunday meetings were over. And I know what that's like. I mean, we went to meetings all day long on Sunday, and I can tell you what it's like as a child being trapped in that kind of a situation where you can't move or you get yourself smacked, taken out into the hall and spanked. It was a horrible, horrible thing. And we had to sit and listen to this indecipherable stuff. I mean, it wasn't like we were being talked to in a way that we could understand. So as children, it just was tedium and boredom. And I think that maybe Malcolm might have experienced the same thing. Who knows? I mean, I'm just surmising here, but based on my own experience and knowing that he was an only child, that he probably, with a father like his, he wasn't pampered. And certainly his father was out for number one. Everybody was subordinate to him. The idea that I can remember in my stupid days, and I was stupid, remember remembering early on in my marriage, because of the way I'd been brought up, telling her, "You do what I say because I'm the man. Uh, I'm the man in this family, and you're the wife, and you're supposed to do what I said." This carried on generation after generation. These were Victorian values that passed down through the Bible students movement. It was a very conservative movement. And I learned what I was saying from my parents and their relationship, and from my grandparents and their relationship, and no doubt my great-grandparents, and all the way back into the 1800s. And so the Bible students really did prolong the Victorian ideas of children and child rearing. And so I think I understand a little about how Malcolm might have felt as a child growing up. There must not have been very many children in rural Missouri where they were living. Boonesville or something like that. But anyway, somebody could correct me there. I didn't check that. I know that Mary was born in Boonesville. I don't think, it didn't say that they lived in St. Louis. I don't know how close to a big city they may have lived. I haven't checked that far. I could do some, but I suspect that they were probably in a rural, somewhat of a rural area in Missouri. And the judge and his wife, by the turn of the century, had really taken to the Bible students very strongly. And being a lawyer, I guess he offered his services to Russell, and they were immersed in 1905. And by 1907, Rutherford was already serving as the counsel for the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. This meant that they had to move to Pennsylvania from Missouri. So here is Malcolm, age, 13? Let's see, 1988, 15, 14, 15 years old, moving to Pennsylvania, into a world that he didn't know, into the Bible house. Okay, and at this time, the Bible house was probably as big as it had ever gotten, because it was late in the game. This was just before they moved to Brooklyn. And so here are all these strange people that he had to get to know. There were no other children, I'm sure of it. If there were other children, they were far and few between. I'm sure Russell filtered those who offered to their volunteer work at the Bible house, like he did at Bethel, to avoid having children at the Bible house. So in the case of Rutherford, there weren't many lawyers in the Bible students movement, so he had to accept the fact that Rutherford had a family. I think this put probably even more onus on Rutherford to keep his family in the background, because the reason they were at the Bible house was because of his skills and his talents, his profession as a lawyer. And Russell really did need it. I mean, he was having legal troubles by this point, especially concerning his divorce with his wife. That was a nasty affair. And so Rutherford probably kept his family in the background and didn't want to promote them. Now, Malcolm was high school age at this point, and it does say in the census records, in one of the census records that I had seen, that he had a high school education. There was one more thing I was going to say. You know, back in the days when Rutherford got his law degree, The requirements for law degree were different in different places, and many colleges had yet to build legal programs into their curriculum. Columbia University, for example, didn't have a law degree program until 1858. Lincoln never went to college. He was self-educated. And for much of the 19th century, legal becoming a lawyer was through sort of an apprenticeship with an actual lawyer. That transformed slowly in the later 19th century to the requirement of attending college, and I'm sure that was the situation with Rutherford. But today, you need 4 years undergraduate, and you got to pass the LSATs, which are a test which allow you to become accepted into a law school, and then you have 3 more years of law school to get your jurisprudence degree, Doctor of Jurisprudence, and then you have to pass the bar exam in order to be a practicing lawyer in a given state. So apparently the conditions were slightly different, because if Rutherford went to school at, let's say, college at age 18, which is the age, college age today, to complete those requirements would mean that he couldn't be practicing in 1894. So we know that he had a practice in 1894. So either he went to school very early, at 16, and attained, the same requirements that we know today, or the requirements were less stringent, maybe 4 years. Who knows how much school was required? I don't know. I didn't really look into it that much, but I do know that Rutherford was practicing by 1894. I surmise that the requirements to be a lawyer were not as rigid and rigorous. Oh my, that's a bald eagle up there. Whoa! Sorry, I get excited every time I see a bald eagle. We have them sit in our trees here every so often. That big branch that you see going out over my head is one that's a favorite perching spot for bald eagles. But anyway, I just wanted to interject that a little bit, because becoming a lawyer in those days wasn't quite as rigorous as it is today, but still, Rutherford he met the requirements. He also passed the bar, and he also had some college education, and probably a 4-year degree. I didn't look into whether or not, he graduated from any particular institution, so that I didn't pursue. But he did have this talent that was necessary at the time. Russell needed him. And I can imagine what it was like. They probably had special living conditions. They didn't just live in the communal part of the, where everybody was given a single room at the Bible house, and that they were to, live with sort of an austere monastery communal system. Being married and having a wife and child, they probably had a different situation. They may have even lived in a separate home. But this still, isolated Malcolm to a great degree. I'm sure that it was hard for him to make friends. He wasn't in high school in Allegheny very long, because the Bible House and the whole Watchtower organization moved to Brooklyn within 2 years. So in 1909, they all had to make this move to Brooklyn, New York. So Malcolm had to change schools and start attending New York public school system in the middle of high school. So Malcolm, if he had a high school degree, as the census records indicate, it would have been with a public school system in New York. And I don't think that he probably made very many friends. Um, he was, of this strange religious background. It just was probably very awkward for him. I can't imagine that there were many children, even in the Bible students movement, at conventions and such. Maybe he made some friends, but who knows? I suspected he was somewhat of a lonely kid. He probably did have acquaintances. He probably did make some friends, but I also think that his father probably made it very difficult for him to be noticed. There's very little. He in the Bible students movement, when certainly he became a man in his own right. I know that they took a trip together in 1914 to England because I found the ship's manifest for Joseph, Mary, and Joseph, Mary, and Jesus. Joseph, Mary, and Malcolm on the Mauritania. They had passage on the Mauritania. I believe it was the manifest from London to New York, and it was in November of 1914. So they had taken a European trip together as a family, and that was the last record that suggested, well, no, it isn't exactly the last record. There was a city directory in Los Angeles. So between 1914, I would imagine that Malcolm, for no better alternative, was required to, when let's say school was out for the summer, or when Malcolm came of age and he graduated his high school, I'm sure that he was put to work at the Bethel, probably doing some menial task, closing boxes or taping boxes closed or whatever in the shipping department somewhere. It's certain that in Bible student history, Malcolm was not a prominent figure at all. He was not a noted speaker. I don't even know. I don't believe he was an elder. His father seems to have done what my father did, which was go out of his way to make sure that Malcolm was not prominent. I don't know why. Malcolm was a good-looking kid. When you look at some early photographs, and if I can get a photograph, I'll interject here. This photograph of Malcolm Rutherford that I downloaded from the internet. There aren't many, but he was a handsome-looking kid in his early 20s. But I don't know. Something caused the Rutherford family to move to East LA, because in 1916 there was record of them living at 128 East Lake Street in Los Angeles. And that's, I did a Google search, and East Lake Street is in an old section of LA on the eastern side of LA. So now it's in East LA. I put it to Street View, and it's a pretty shabby area of town today. It's run down, very old homes, circa early 20th century, probably the homes were probably newer, painted, and somewhat decent to live in at that time. There is some suggestion that Rutherford was working as a salesman in a department store at the time, just before Russell's death. That Russell and Rutherford had some kind of falling out, although Rutherford was still used by Russell. He served as a representative speaker for the Watchtower, I believe, at a Maryland convention at the time Russell died. Now, Russell, his last trip was to Los Angeles, actually, to a convention in Los Angeles in 1916, and on the return trip, he died. His health was in bad shape when he left, and he died on the return trip in Pampas, Texas. And according to Macmillan's Faith on the March, they called Rutherford, who was serving at a Maryland convention at the time, and told him that the old man was dead. And so I guess that was how they referred to Russell. I don't know if it was an affectionate or derogatory term that they used behind his back, but that's from Faith on the March. And so Rutherford propelled himself immediately into the fray of succession. Now, his official residence was listed in 1916 on East Lake Street. Now, Malcolm and Joseph Rutherford were listed separately in the same city directory in 1916, and the street address for the two of them was the same. So they were living in the same house. Now, Malcolm in 1916 would have been 24 years old, and so they were all living together. Now, for how long this situation was, I don't know. But the household was listed under both Joseph's name and Malcolm's name. Now, I assume Mary lived with them, and it's possible that Pauline, who was Malcolm's wife. Now, Malcolm got married at age 23, March 28th in 1916, to Pauline Short. And I believe she probably was a Bible student that met with the Los Angeles class, and maybe, who knows, the four of them lived together in the same house. I believe they were renting at the time, because a later census indicated that, I believe, if I recall correctly, the 1920 census showed Mary at the same address, 128 East Lake Street, as renting. But it's possible that that they owned the home. I have to check my record. I've got a bunch of notes written down here in this computer, and I've been going from memory, actually. So I do have records here that I had written down, sources. Okay, now we talked about that. But I found it interesting. Here we go. Here's the 1960. 1916, the entire Rutherford family, including Malcolm, lived in L.A. on Northeast Lake Road. A city directory listed both Joseph and Malcolm separately, but at the same address. My assumption is Mary lived there too, and if it was after March, it's Pauline, Malcolm's wife, would have lived there with them. They were married. Malcolm and Pauline were married on March 28th. And the 1920 census for Malcolm and his mother show that they were in the LA area. Mary's, both of their address was on East Lake Street. Now, Mary lived at 128 East State Street, which was the same address as the 1916 directory that Joseph was listed under. And Malcolm, at this point, lived in 124 East Lake Street. So it was probably right next door or no more than a couple houses away. So they lived in very close proximity to one another. And again, it wasn't a really upscale area of town. Even back then, it couldn't have been. It wasn't bad. It wasn't Beth Surrem. That's for certain. Let's see. The census records in 1920 do show the ages of Malcolm and Pauline 2 years off incorrectly. And it indicates that Malcolm worked as a lawyer. And I saw stuff on the internet that indicated that he was a lawyer. I think that this census worker was not very careful. He didn't get their ages right. I don't believe with a high school degree that Malcolm could be working in Los Angeles as a lawyer. Not in the 1920s, for certain. I think that he probably misunderstood. They may have said something about Malcolm's father being a lawyer, and so the census taker probably mixed the information up and listed Malcolm as a lawyer. Malcolm was listed in 1940 as having a high school degree and working as a legal clerk. Now that's a different thing. And I think he may have been a stenographer, but he was a legal clerk, and I think that's all he ever worked at, as it was a legal clerk. Now, the rumor has it that Mary never lost her faith, that she was a faithful witness to the end of her life, and she lived till she was like 92 years old when she died in 1962. And she went to meetings, Jehovah's Witness meetings, until she was so incapacitated that she couldn't attend. But it seems to me that she and Malcolm lived in close proximity, because if it's true that she did have health issues, that her son felt responsible for her care. Certainly, Joseph abandoned them. When he became president in 1917, he soon as Russell was dead, Rutherford rushed off to the Bethel to help. He was, part of the management committee and part of the editorial committee that they set up, and he started getting into the political fray of the succession efforts after Russell died. The Watchtower held its annual meeting on January 8th, 1917, and in that meeting was when Rutherford was the only nominee for president, and nominations were closed by A.H. Macmillan, and there was a unanimous vote to elect Rutherford president in 1917, January. And so it seems from the 1920 census that that address, 128 East Lake Street, was was occupied continuously. So, in other words, um, Mary didn't go east at all. It was that circumstance, the death of Russell. I'm not sure she even, maybe she attended the funeral, Russell's funeral. There's no record of it, but she went back. If she did go east for a while, she went back to Los Angeles. Things had deteriorated between she and Rutherford to the point where they made their separation at this point when Rutherford became president. So Malcolm resided in 1920 at that same address. So I presume that neither Malcolm or his mother left L.A. at all. And there's a later census that in 1940 that shows Malcolm working as a legal clerk. He only had a high school degree, which I guess, for that time, for that era, wasn't bad for a person of his generation. My grandfather only had an 8th grade degree. I mean, Russell only had a 7th grade education. When I said degree, I mean 8th grade education. So Malcolm had a high school education, but he worked as a legal clerk. In 1940, his mother was residing at 128 East Lake Street, and Malcolm lived at 124th East Lake Street. So they stayed there for a long, long time. There's no indication that Malcolm ever was an elder or a deacon, or maybe he was, but he was never elevated to any kind of a point or position of importance or notable mention in either the Bible students or later Jehovah's Witnesses. It seems he wanted to keep a low profile. And I can understand that, and to some degree, I think with a father like Rutherford, that maybe Malcolm was beaten. Maybe he didn't feel that a whole lot of self-confidence. I mean, he earned in 1940, he was earning $2,700 a year. Now, when you account for inflation, and I put this into an inflation calculator, that amounts to $47,000 a year. Now, Pauline was shown as not working. Mary was shown as head of household, but not working. And no specified income for Mary. And $47,000 a year, even back, is not an income that you can own your home. They were listed as owning the home. Own your home and be able to support a family of two with that little money, especially in a big city like L.A. So I find it very difficult to think that was their only source of income. There are speculations, and because neither Mary nor Malcolm said anything, never stirred the pot, never criticized, never openly criticized, publicly criticized Rutherford in any way, that they were being paid off. Well, there could be various reasons for that. Malcolm's sense of self-confidence could have been growing up under a father like him who probably touted himself as being the smartest and the greatest there ever was, and that he had no hope of ever accomplishing what his great father could accomplish. Probably had a low sense of esteem. Now, this is my own opinion. Uh, it could be far from the truth. I don't know, but I just surmise that this could be the situation. It didn't seem like Malcolm had much ambition to, not like the judge. Certainly, the judge had tremendous ambition. His ego is so huge. You know, he became the lawyer. He became the counsel of Watchtower. He had an overblown sense of his own importance, and he was a tyrant and an autocrat as president, and so he had an inflated sense of self, which, when you grow up under somebody like that, and my father was very much like that, that you come to believe that you yourself don't have much ability, that there's no way that you could ever meet these astronomically high standards and accomplishments that this man god could accomplish, you know. So it's possible that he just had no fight in him, you know. He was resigned, you know. Maybe there was some supplemental income. I wouldn't be surprised if Rutherford threw some token amount of money to his family as, in his mind, setting his conscious, whatever sense of conscious, not conscious, conscientiousness that that he had with respect to his obligations to support his family. Maybe he threw some token amount of support to clear his conscience. I have trouble with that word. So I'm speculating on that, but it's possible. I don't see how Mary could have supported herself or Malcolm on the kind of income that they were getting. Now, there is another record that is kind of interesting. On the internet, there's a lot that I found that talked about reconciliation between Malcolm and his father. And I wonder about that. I don't know. I can't imagine that they did reconcile. First, according to Macmillan in his account of Rutherford, only 4 people attended his funeral. You know, there was this big controversy about Rutherford and his health and all that, and but he wasn't a very well liked person, and in the account that Macmillan reports, that when after the debacle of where Rutherford was going to be buried, because the city of San Diego was adamant about not zoning Beth Sarim as a cemetery, so they had to, after 5 months after the judge died in January of 1942, that they had to ship his body back east and bury it in the Staten Island graveyard, Yorkville, Staten Island. And it's an unmarked grave, so nobody knows who's buried where. And so, but this is, so there have been rumors that he was secretly buried at Besserim, but it's more likely that they ended up having to ship his body all the way back east. And there were only 4 people that attended this funeral, and I'm sure Macmillan was one and Vandenberg was the other. Not even Knorr or Franz attended this funeral. And Malcolm and his mother were not there. There was no way that they would attend Rutherford's funeral. So I don't think there was any reconciliation between them. There was bad blood between them all the way through. Now, some cite that Rutherford went on a vacation with Malcolm and his wife, and it was a reconciliation. Well, the records I found suggest something different happened. It was very strange what I found. Now, there is a record in 1938 that around April 30th, that Malcolm, his wife Pauline, and Berta Peel, there's a ship's manifest that I found, that they went to Hawaii on April 30th. It was a 5-day voyage. They landed in Honolulu on May 5th and then departed on May 11th to return to Port Los Angeles on May 16th of 1938. So they were in Hawaii for a week. Now, the only one listed on that manifest was Berta Peel. Joseph was not on that manifest. They did not go to Hawaii with his father. They went with Berta Peel. Why? Why would they go with the mistress? I can't imagine it was a bonding. Let's bond. I mean, if there was bonding, it wouldn't be with the mistress. Getting to know you is not done with the mistress. What I found was Rutherford was in Sydney, Australia, and he was sailing on a vessel that was going to stop through Hawaii on one day to pick up passengers to return to Los Angeles on May 16th. He was on board that ship that had left Sydney, Australia, and was stopping in the port of Honolulu for one day to pick up passengers and to head on to port of Los Angeles. Now, that was the ship that Malcolm and Pauline and Berta Peel took back to port of Los Angeles. So the 4 of them, Joseph Rutherford, Berta Peel, Malcolm, and his wife, were on the same ship returning from Hawaii. Now, Rutherford spent no time in Hawaii with his son, except for whatever short period they were in the port of Honolulu. There was no great vacation together in paradise. It was just a quick stopover. Now, why? Why would that be? Here's one idea I had. Here's Rutherford living in Besserim. Now, there are recently released films old home movies of Rutherford late in life, probably just before he died, at his 100-acre estate. Now, the Betzerim at the time was a farm. It had 100 acres. If you look it up today, it's a very tightly packed neighborhood on top of a mesa. But back when Rutherford lived at Betzerim, it was rural and it was a farm. They planted it. They produced food. They produced fruit, and you can see all of this in the film with Rutherford, and he's acting a fool. He probably was drunk when they made these videos. He stuck his tongue out. You got to see a side of this guy that is just unbelievable. I mean, why would he stick his tongue out? It's like a child. It is an act of defiance, but a very childish one. And it's like, I'm king, nah, 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 nah. It was very weird. But nonetheless, they had a staff there. Now, Berta Peel was staff. She was his nutritionist. She had no training as a nutritionist, but anyway, she was serving certain needs for the man, and living the lifestyle of the rich and famous in this little paradise in San Diego. And their photo, the video shows strapping young men, really strapping, no doubt, Bethelites, young men who worked the farm, and no doubt had some close relationship with Rutherford, because he had moved there full time. Now here's Rutherford living in the lap of luxury in San Diego, full-time pretty much by 1938, which was only a few years before he died. And here's his wife and son living in East LA, just 2 hours to the north. I don't know, they didn't have interstates then, so maybe it was a longer drive. But anyway, it wasn't too far. It was within a few hours drive to the north. And they weren't living as anywhere near the conditions that Rutherford was living in. And it could well be, now again, this is only my speculation, that when taking care of his family, because he just dropped them like a stone, it could be that whatever he was doing for them wasn't really enough for them to survive, especially the mother. I think Malcolm stayed nearby his mom to take care of her. He was a conscientious son, and he, no doubt, lived close by to her to see to her needs, especially if she was an invalid. And I wonder, now, who knows? There's no record of it, but it's possible that having access to the judge by this point was nearly impossible, even though he was only 3 hours away. He had this estate. There was on-ground staff. Who knows? They could have been, they doubled not only as farm workers, but maybe as bodyguards for Rutherford. He was somewhat paranoid. I mean, he always thought the government was out to get him, and religion is a racket, a snare and a racket, and he had a degree of paranoia, especially against the government, and for having, there's some reason for that, having been thrown in jail. And apparently during the time he was in jail, He wasn't visited by his, in the 9 months he was in Atlanta prison, he wasn't visited by his family. And why should they? Why should they? It was all the way in Atlanta. They were in Los Angeles, clear across the country. And he had abandoned them. So why go visit the bastard? So I'm speculating that Malcolm knew or caught wind that the judge had gone to Australia and that he was alone. And there was some real need for them to talk, and it was probably the staff at Bethsarim were given orders that if you see Malcolm, don't let him on the property. So, it's possible that there was a lack of contact. And, the Bible student, Jehovah's Witness, grapevine, I think it's probably worse than the Bible students. When anything happened in the Bible students, it was instantly across the country. So I think Malcolm probably learned somehow through any association he might have had in the LA Jehovah's Witnesses or Ecclesia at the time, may have learned that the judge was in Sydney, that he had gone to Australia, and learned what ship he would be on, and went out to Hawaii with his wife to meet him, to intercept him alone, to speak with him about the situation that they were under, whatever business he felt his father was obligated to meet in their support, especially his mother's support. I suspect that may be a likely scenario. It certainly wasn't fun in Hawaii. They weren't surfing together. It was an interception. They intercepted him because they knew the ship was going to make a stopover. And they since they were going out, they might as well spend a week there. And because of the Bible student Jehovah's Witness grapevine, it probably news that Malcolm was going to Hawaii to intercept his father, made its way to Bethsarim. And Berta then booked a passage to Hawaii to serve as a buffer between him, as sort of an intermediate in case things got hot between father and son. She probably was there to protect the judge. And again, this is just my speculation. I don't see that they all went with the judge's mistress to greet the grand master king of Watchtower in Hawaii because they were so excited he was coming back from Sydney. I don't think that was the scenario. I don't think they were trying to have fun and to get to know Berta, the mistress. No, this was some other situation. And they knew that being on board the ship, that Rutherford had nowhere else to go, and that they were stuck on the same ship together for 5 days. An ocean voyage for 5 days from Hawaii to Los Angeles is not a bonding experience either. So this was not a reconciliation in my estimation. It was probably somehow, some way, it was Malcolm's only recourse to access the judge to take care of obligations he felt that were necessary for his mother. And they did again live either next door or no more than a couple houses away, given the addresses that were given for the both of them in 1940. Now that just about depletes all the records. There's only one more record that I know, two more records that I know of. The one is the death of Pauline Short Rutherford, who was Malcolm's wife. There's no record of him ever remarrying. She died in 1948. So only 6 years after the death of Judge Rutherford, Malcolm's wife passes away. Malcolm seems to have become a recluse. He faded from attending meetings. Who knows? His mother certainly remained loyal to the faith, at least the Watchtower faith. She didn't remain loyal to her husband. I think she did in a way by keeping silent. Now that may be partly because he would lift the support that she needed who had an interest in this whole thing? Well, the judge was dead in 1942, but the successive president, Knorr and Fred Franz, they had a big interest in Mary's silence. By this point, by the 1940s and 50s, the organization was growing at an exponential rate. It was just exploding. They didn't want anything to interrupt that. So they probably kept up their obligation, or Rutherford's obligation, to keep Mary supported. They had an interest in keeping her quiet. They also had an interest in keeping Malcolm quiet. Now, who knows? Could Malcolm just be so down on the world, so defeated? I can understand that he was a beaten man. His wife died. He lived another 40 years alone after his wife died. He died an old man, 96 in 1989. Malcolm, there's one last record, his death record, and he was buried in Forest Lawn Cemetery in Los Angeles in 1989. And that's it. There's no other record of Malcolm. He was quiet. He didn't speak out. He did get to see the Watchtower through its entire development. He saw the Watchtower grow from the 1890s, when he was a boy, when his father first took interest. He knew Russell. There's no question that he had met Russell. How close they were, who knows? Maybe Rutherford kept his family away from Russell. But there's no question that at some point they interacted. There's no question that Russell would have known Malcolm. He would have insisted on saying hello or whatever, or having dinner with Rutherford and the Rutherford family. Who knows? But there's no question he knew Russell, and he saw the growth of the Watchtower through the era after his father. He saw the transformation of the Watchtower during his father, what his father turned the Watchtower into. He saw his father's character infused into the character of the organization itself. Rutherford's DNA is in the DNA of the Watchtower organization, in a metaphorical sense, and it's evident today. The fact that men can't wear beards, that people can shun, that Rutherford was a harsh man who shunned quite a few people, disfellowshipped quite a large number of people in his day. He set the pattern for shunning. If it was not official policy, it became it because of Rutherford. And Malcolm saw the character of his father infused within the organization and the men that ran that organization. And he saw the demise of the office of presidency and the rise of the governing body, the coup d'etat, the last end time prediction. You know, Malcolm Rutherford saw the failure of all those predictions. He saw the failure of 1874 and 1878 and 1914 and 1925 and 1975, and he saw the growth of the Watchtower into the millions. The Watchtower was in the millions by 1989 in its membership, and yet he stayed quiet. He never opened his mouth in terms of a critical, way against his father. I guess he felt it was futile. Maybe that's what it was. What was he fighting? This was just before the internet. This was just before the average person had the power to say anything. So I think Malcolm may have been kind of a beaten person. I hope he wasn't bitter, but I think he was lonely. I think he was a sad person. But somehow, some way, he managed to live a long life, but I don't know what kind of a life that was. I hope he had some happiness. I mean, it's so difficult in this life I could have let my experience destroy me as a young man, and I was heading in the same direction as my brother who committed suicide. I had problems that needed resolution, or it was going to kill me. And Malcolm survived this abuse, this abandonment, this demeaning treatment by this horrible man. I can't imagine. You know, Toni Morris may be the only other leader of the Watchtower that had children. And you can see what kind of an awful man he is, holding back licenses at the age of 16 unless you baptize. He was a blackmailer. He was a coerced, uses coercion. Well, can you imagine what it was like growing up the son of Rutherford? So what about Malcolm? Who was this guy? What do we know? Very little. But I do hope that there was some measure, there were some periods of happiness, and I just wish that I had known a little about him. I might have made an attempt to speak with him, although he was in California, but I don't know. Anyway, this is Truth Seeker here. The mystery, I don't think, is solved, but there's some facts that are indelible about him, about Malcolm and his life. and putting some things together that seem reasonable, and putting that together in conjunction with what small facts that we do know that are on the records, because they're the only records that we have available. We have nothing else. There are no more eyewitnesses. And there's nobody who ever knew Malcolm who has written anything about what they've known about him. There's no bio that I can find on Malcolm Rutherford. So he probably didn't have any close associates or friends who would do such a thing, knowing his relationship to the Watchtower, his relationship to Rutherford, and the fact that his life spanned the entire development of the Watchtower. So anyway, I see the time is really gone on, and I don't want to get too long. This is Truth Seeker wishing you a very good weekend. This is a long weekend for me, and kickoff of summer, and I hope everybody enjoys the day. It's a beautiful day, and I think it's time for me to go wake up my wife. So long, everybody, and I wish you the best.